The churches were crowded to overflowing. It was standing room only. In a letter to the president, one observer described the Philadelphia scene this way. Occasionally they sang and shouted and wept and prayed. God knows I cried with them. The mention of your name evoked a spontaneous benediction from the whole congregation. No doubt of the coming of your proclamation beset any of them. As one of their speakers was explaining the effect of your act, he was interrupted by a sudden outburst from 400 or 500 voices singing the Year of Jubilee. Today, he concluded, all of the city's 20 Black churches were open and filled. In Philadelphia, as in Boston, New York, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and other towns large and small, African Americans welcomed the new year, 1863, with joy and anticipation for what it would bring. The year started with President Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the state still in rebellion, and committing the Union to ending slavery everywhere else. What a great way to start a new year. And this lecture series is a great way to start this year, the 150th anniversary of that historic document. It would be years before the last slaves were free, but with the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States had joined the rest of the civilized world that had been for some time on an abolitionist trajectory. On behalf of Africana Studies, let me welcome you all to the first in a series of events planned to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. My name is Judy Giesberg. I'm a professor in the history department. I'm standing in for Professor Crystal Lucky, who is the chair of Africana Studies. And today I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, William Blair, professor of history at the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Blair is director of the George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center at Penn State. He also edits the Journal of the Civil War Era and the Bros Lecture Series, both published through the University of North Carolina Press. Before that, for about 10 years, he edited Civil War history. In all of these positions, Bill has relentlessly promoted the careers of junior faculty, worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between academic and popular history, and helped to move the field of Civil War studies in exciting new directions. So we're very excited to have him here to start this lecture series off. Busy looking out for everybody else's career, Bill has managed to write many books of his own, including a couple of sole-authored books. He's edited 3, I think I've counted all these right, and written more than 13 chapters and articles in various collections. In 2009 in particular, Bill co-edited with Karen Fisher Younger a collection called Lincoln's Proclamation, Emancipation Reconsidered. And in the essay that he contributed to that volume, Celebrating Freedom, the Problem of Emancipation in Public Commemoration, Bill pointed out how celebrations of emancipation have often been derailed by the necessary recollection of slavery. Celebrating emancipation, Bill reminded his readers in that essay, can become an awkward acknowledgement of the enormous and abiding influence of slavery. Can we celebrate freedom, he asked, without dwelling on slavery? Today, he's taking this exploration of the Emancipation Proclamation in new directions. You'll see, I'll say no more about that, but he will continue that conversation and answer some of those, or raise some of those questions again, and some new ones. Before I turn it over to Bill, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank the person who originally thought up this series on emancipation, Cleet Bonds, friend of Africana Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, the English department, huge Civil War buff, and the late husband of Ellen Bonds. It was Cleet's idea that Villanova would run a conference on emancipation, by the way, way before anybody else was thinking about running conferences on emancipation, and we think it was a pretty good one. Thank you, Cleet. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you all for coming, and most of all, thank you, Bill Blair, for setting us off. Please join me in welcoming Professor William Blair.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for coming. I told Judy a long time ago I had been an applicant here for undergrad at Villanova and was accepted, and I didn't come. And now, as I see your beautiful campus, I'm having second thoughts, especially since, unlike Penn State, you actually have a real basketball team. So congratulations on a big win earlier this week. The title of my talk is actually a little different from the stated one. And actually, I was dealing with another question concerning emancipation, and it's reclaiming emancipation for African Americans. Can it be done? And I think you'll see why as I start to go into this talk. Over the past 50 years, Abraham Lincoln and emancipation celebrations have not fared quite as well as in the past among African Americans. For nearly 100 years after the proclamation was issued, Black Americans embraced it as a centerpiece of important community rituals. But since the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the intimate acquaintance with the proclamation has diminished, and it is easy today to find criticism of the president and his measures. Last September, an article appeared in the Sunday Review of the New York Times by African-American historian Scott Hancock of Gettysburg College, who proclaimed that, quote, Lincoln was no friend, unquote, of African Americans, quote, and his proclamation was no gift, unquote. He singled out the faults of the proclamation for not creating a general emancipation and declared that the executive order freed no one. It was an act taken for white Americans, not Black Americans, because it helped secure national preservation. Quote, Lincoln's proclamation and the sacrifice of our nation's citizenry did serve a crucial nation-changing purpose, just not one initiated for African Americans, unquote. Well, similarly, despite the work of scholars, public amnesia remains in force concerning a commemorative culture of freedom and the Civil War that for nearly a century flourished in Black communities. Last summer, I was struck by the irony. It was common to find media commentators focusing on Juneteenth. Who has heard about that, Juneteenth? Good. This was a moment, recognizing a moment when slaves in Galveston, Texas, in 1865, learned about freedom. A website dedicated to this celebration actually begins, quote, Juneteenth is the oldest known celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, unquote. Very little about this statement is true. Again, websites. It was not the first commemoration. And until perhaps the last 40 years, it was not even observed by most of the country, but represented at best a regional holiday. Instead, just about every town with a significant African American population conducted observances of the proclamation on January 1, for when it was finally issued, September 22nd, when the preliminary version was issued, or on dates specific to their own liberation, such as April 16th in Washington, D.C., which is still observed today. That's when the Congress ended slavery in the District of Columbia. The Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln were central to the rituals, although not always as white Americans would like to believe. So I'd like to reflect today on the reasons why Lincoln has become more commonly referred to as a reluctant emancipator, and why a commemorative tradition of freedom has, if not died, has not returned to its former glory. I must admit up front that I may have an imperfect understanding of where Lincoln stands in the minds of African Americans today, because it's based on my own impressions from teaching, lecturing, reading, mixed race presentations through a UNESCO project that we used to do on the African slave trade, but it's not based on a systematic sampling to get that data back. It's possible and probable, in fact, that emancipation remains important, but Lincoln less so. That it is more common among African Americans to qualify Lincoln as more interested in national preservation than human rights. As for commemorations, there are signs of African Americans creating new traditions and new identities with the 19th century freedom struggle, especially through, and I've seen this a lot, new reenactment units, for example, for U.S. colored troops. Today's Emancipation Day celebration that does go on in Washington, D.C. And in fact, the new monumentation in Washington, D.C. This is the African American Museum, which is right around the corner, and the community there put up this statue that commemorates the 200,000 African Americans who were served as both soldiers and sailors in the Union military during the Civil War, fighting for their own liberation. I showed you two sides of it so you could see they cover the the Army on one side, the Navy on the other side. What you can't see is that all around this are the names inscribed of every soldier who fought. Who of you have seen this? Not many. It's at the U Street corridor, right around the corner from Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a great place to stop. You can't miss it if you come right up out of the metro. You will land right in front of this at the U Street corridor. I also think it's defensible to say that the Civil War does not resonate as much with black people as it does with white people, and for many understandable reasons. This much was suggested in an article that appeared last year in the Atlantic magazine online, which noted the lack of interest by African Americans in the Civil War in general. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article titled, quote, "Why do so few blacks study the Civil War?" unquote. An African American, he is an enthusiastic consumer of this history. But when recalling his first trip to Gettysburg as a school child, he said, quote, "Our general sense of the war was that a horrible tragedy somehow had the magical effect of getting us free. Its legacy belonged not to us, but to those who reveled in the costume and technology of a time, reenactors, when we were property." He then put his finger on the problem when he said, for so long the Civil War has been, quote, "a story for white people, acted out by white people, on white people's terms, in which blacks feature strictly as stock characters and props. We are invited to listen, but never to truly join the narrative," unquote. I want to take us back in time to the Civil War to see how we got here. And in making this journey, we will see that African Americans from the start had a complicated relationship with Lincoln as an emancipator. During the war, he seemed to proceed too slowly toward anti-slavery to suit most abolitionists, whether white or black. Frederick Douglass at first questioned Lincoln's motives and denounced the president's, his words, imbecility in reversing the emancipation order of a Union general in 1861. Even deep into 1862, Lincoln's stance on colonization, meaning the voluntary relocation of black people out of the country, and his overturning of another emancipation order by a Union general caused concern among abolitionists. A vexed Douglass, in August of 1863, criticized the president, saying every move since he took office, quote, "has been calculated in a marked and decided way to shield and protect slavery," unquote. Well, attitudes began to change as the president issued his Emancipation Proclamations of September 1862 and January 1863. You have some nice evidence on the wall of Douglass and others waiting on the scripts on your wall, waiting for whether Lincoln would actually follow through and whether emancipation, as limited as it was, would even come. So they had watch night observances in church halls on the night before this significant event. And when the day came and the audience heard that Lincoln had fulfilled his promise, cheers erupted. Celebrations were held in Boston at Tremont Temple. And in the Sea Islands, black people joined with Union soldiers to mark this historic milestone. This is a representation of one such event, showing Sea Islands. This is the first South Carolina regiment. It's really one of the first black units ever raised in the Civil War. And on January 1, they are fully participating in one of the first Emancipation Day celebrations, easily way out in front of Juneteenth. In fact, there was an even earlier commemoration in May of '62 by African Americans in New York who were honoring freedom that had come to Washington, D.C. So it was happening right from the get-go. Douglass, in his post-war memoirs, remembered about the Boston event that no one criticized the proclamation at this particular time. At the moment, he said, we saw only its anti-slavery side. And he added, the 1st of January, 1863, was a memorable day in the progress of American liberty and civilization. It was the turning point in the conflict between freedom and slavery. But Black Americans also tempered their assessments of Lincoln and the proclamation, taking into account the complicated nature of emancipation and the motivations of white people. Further examination of the document, according to Douglass, quote, showed it to be extremely defective, unquote. It did not proclaim liberty throughout the land. It did not include the loyal border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, all of which still had slavery. And it exempted the Union-occupied portions of the Confederacy, such as parts of Louisiana and Virginia. So it is true that it did not free any slave as soon as it was issued. However, it did free slaves encountered by the U.S. military from thenceforward. Freedom depended on the Union Army. Without victories over the rebels, without the corresponding advances by the military into Confederate territory, slavery remained. And it is also true that universal emancipation, meaning for everybody, complete, universal emancipation was not guaranteed even with victory over the rebels. Many white Northerners, as shockingly as this sounds, and I sometimes can't wrap my mind around this, but as shockingly as it sounds, many white Northerners still thought that slavery could exist with the war's ending, with only the people who had gained freedom during the conflict retaining their liberty and the rest remaining enslaved. Exactly what happened during the Revolutionary War. Douglass, however, also saw the revolutionary potential of the proclamation, which contained the chief executive's announced desire to begin recruiting and enlisting black soldiers for the military. Having black males don the Union blue seemed to him to signal the death knell of slavery, no matter how limited was the proclamation's reach. In this regard, the proclamation had changed everything, he wrote. It gave new direction to discussions in the cabinet and the conduct of national arms. So he actually came around to liking Lincoln, especially as he recognized the president's growth during the war, even if he remained a flawed figure. This was also an opinion expressed much later, this surprised me, by W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most important black figures throughout the 20th century, who said, quote, I love him, not because he was perfect, but because he was not, and yet triumphed, unquote. But even among the admirers of the president can be found a certain amount of ambivalence. A speech by the Reverend Dr. William H. Longfellow to the citizens at Kennett Square in Chester County, Pennsylvania, not too far from here, I imagine, captures the conflicted nature of black sensibilities concerning Lincoln and emancipation. He delivered the address on January 1, 1866. Why? Are you awake out there?
Everybody's.
It's the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and these celebrations are in full swing. So it is clear that the anniversary warranted notice, and it was important. And Lincoln's role in freedom was acknowledged. Longfellow even used the term great emancipator. However, in this case, the speaker did not mean the president, but a higher power. I believe that today, Longfellow said, we should render thanks unto God, for it is to him that all glory belongs, and to no one else. He is the great emancipator. He has unshackled the slave and given liberty to the millions, unquote. In other words, Longfellow believed that Lincoln did not act on behalf of justice and humanity for black people, but to save the Union. He might not have acted at all, according to Longfellow, without just a little nudge from the Creator. Well, over the 50 to 75 years after Lincoln's death, two contradictory images formed concerning Lincoln and emancipation. Lincoln as slavery's enemy was one, and Lincoln as the reluctant emancipator was another. One scholar has argued, and I think he's right, that the first image dominated among African Americans into the 1920s. But even in these more sympathetic versions, we can find correctives. African Americans believed that the president acted in the interests of national survival rather than black rights, that he served as an agent of God's will, and that black people earned their liberation by their political engagement and by the resistance that included fleeing bondage and serving as U.S. colored troops. As we talk about the evolution of Emancipation Days after the war, it is important to remember these emphases, that while Lincoln and the proclamation served as key symbols, their use in black commemorations did not mean an uncritical acceptance of the president as emancipator or come without acknowledging black service in their own liberation. Well, the pace picked up on these commemorations as the war ended, and the calendar quickly became crowded. Depending on where they lived, African Americans observed the occasion on different dates that reflected personal moments of freedom. One historian of these practices has counted that at least 15 different celebrations thrived in black communities around the country. For instance, Lincoln's proclamation offered two choices, right? September 22nd for the preliminary version and January 1. So two chances to party, actually. You may as well take them. Then there were the days held as sacred, the moment when black people in a particular region won their liberation. These were often tied either to the appearance of the Union Army or to the defeat of the Confederate military. Richmond residents, for example, celebrated on April 3rd, when Lee's army fled the capital, while others preferred April 9th, when that army surrendered at Appomattox. And of course, there was June 19th, 1865, when the enslaved at Galveston learned about their freedom. Well, most of these events assumed very similar forms, with black veterans prominently on display in the early years. Emancipation Days typically featured a procession that could stretch as much as a mile. Black men wore their Union uniforms, and ministers served as leaders. Heroes were cited. Now get ready, you've flunked the first quiz. I'm going to see if you can do better on the second quiz. Ministers served as leaders too. Heroes were cited. Lincoln did appear upon this list. Just to show you that in 1888, he is associated with Emancipation Day celebrations. This is in Richmond. We don't know how he's being interpreted from this image, but we at least know that he is a part of the community's remembrance. It's a bad photo, I know, but that is Lincoln up there, trust me. And you can see that he is still figuring in the mix. However, he's not the only hero. Here's the quiz. I've done this with my students too, and believe me, I don't think I've had anyone pass this, which is making a point. If I, and I always have done this, start out a Civil War class saying, name me 5 heroes of the war, I can tell you who the 5 heroes are going to be who come up. I can tell you who doesn't. These were renowned heroes of African Americans in the 19th century. Anybody? Anybody? What's the name of that guy? Bueller. Anybody? Believe me, you're in good company. I've had nobody pass this.
One of them Smalls?
No. That's a good guess, though.
Thank you.
The guess was one of them Robert Smalls, who was very famous and became a black politician after the Civil War. Has anybody seen the movie Glory? Okay, we're getting some good nods there. Well, I'll pass this on and give you their names. The left is, the leftmost guy is the real, I don't know if he's Morgan Freeman or Denzel Washington, but he is in real life Sergeant William Carney, former slave who became a Union soldier And all he did was take the Union flag up to the parapet of Fort Wagner, wounded twice on the way up, realized that the men couldn't stay, made his way back, wounded 2 more times at least on the way back, and the flag never touched the ground. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He's not in the movie Glory. Next man is Lewis Douglas, Frederick Douglass's son, also wounded in that same assault on Fort Wagner. Lewis Douglas is not in the movie Glory. Guy on the complete right end is Christian Fleetwood. There was a battle of Newmarket Heights, or Chaffin's Farm, outside of Virginia in June of 1864. All he did was exactly what Sergeant William Carney did: lead troops in battle, pick up the flag as wounded color bearers fell, led the charge into the midst of other soldiers, wounded, came back, lived, and won the Congressional Medal of Honor. I'm not surprised. Any African American in the late 19th century would have known these men. We don't now. And I mean white or black, to be honest. Or these guys. They never appear on the list of heroes in my classes. Frederick Douglass once in a while, because he's so famous. And I just learned from a guy who was interviewing with us that he is actually the most photographed American in the 19th century. More than Lincoln, more than anybody else. Guy on the right, John Brown. Never pops up on white lists of heroes. Most white people consider him terrorist. Believe me, 19th century African Americans lionized this man and considered him a committed revolutionary to the cause. And anyway, the point I'm trying to make is there are differences in the way people remember, consume, and understand the American Civil War. Okay, whenever these parades would arrive at a certain place, like a public square, the crowd listened to orations from prominent community leaders. A central ritual was the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was considered an honor. Although I have to admit, I don't think any of us could stay awake through that part of the ceremony. Have any of you tried to read the proclamation? It's a great thing for you to do at the bedside at night when you're really trying to go to sleep, because it is a turgid legalistic document without any ounce of poetry to it. I don't know if poetry can have ounces, but there you have it. This, I'm going to just let you read on your own, gives you a sense of what these celebrations were like. For me, I would like to be at this party. I mean, this looks like fun. You could see the martial air. You could see the excitement. You could sense the pride in the people and in the people who are watching this particular parade. Here were former slaves, remember, who had been prevented from mass assembly before the war, who before the war, their principal group procession was in a slave coffle. They're now dominating public space, and they're carrying weapons. Life has changed. Just as irritating to the former rebels was that the events acknowledged and welcomed, remember, they're on the same dates, usually, of Southern defeat. That's interesting. And black veterans marched in these parades at a time when the United States government prevented the former Confederates from wearing their uniforms in public. They were not allowed to do so because they were traitors. You're not going to let them keep those uniforms on. Well, over time, Emancipation Day events underwent changes corresponding to the increased constraints on their liberties in the era of segregation and disfranchisement, but it's clear that they hung in there for a good long time. In 1905, this is the scene of the Emancipation Day celebration in Richmond. Significant time because it's a 40th anniversary of the proclamation, or the end of the war. A newspaper account indicated that there had been a parade, which took 20 minutes to pass a given point. And remember, this occurred on April 3rd, which was a Monday, a working day. It's not a national holiday. So there are a lot of people who may, in fact, in this crowd have lost wages just to turn out and do this. Emancipation days, however, began as we get deeper into the 20th century to show signs of wear. Through the first decades, one can find increasing complaints among black speakers about a declining interest. The ceremonies remain part of life, featuring speakers from organizations like the NAACP, who criticized the oppression that black Americans faced. They would use these events as a forum for that. But various pressures were starting to register. One was a changing generation. Younger people who had not known slavery and did not always want to remember the past were actually just losing interest. And at a gathering in 1932 in Pittsburgh, the speaker admitted to his audience, quote, "There are quite a number of people of our group who feel embarrassed at emancipation celebrations," unquote. But there were other elements in play. White coercion had increased. With the decline of black public officials through Jim Crow, white public officials controlled the permits for staging celebrations and sometimes denied access to public halls or public grounds. This happened in Warrenton, Georgia in 1930, when it became known that a black speaker might advocate for social equality. The courthouse was denied as a meeting place, and black leaders canceled the whole affair just to avoid the controversy. And then, of course, there were other means of discouraging black celebrations. White employers were not sympathetic to necessarily letting black people attend these kind of events. And one black writer hinted as much in 1938 when he said that when asked why he did not support Emancipation Day, quote, "I can't get off the job. My boss won't let me off, and I might lose my job," unquote. And we're to blame too. By that I mean historians and educators. By the 1890s, white Americans began to agree on an interpretation of the Civil War known as the lost cause. It became well accepted in the academy to treat slavery as an ancillary cause of the war, to stress that state rights was the catalyst, to blame Lincoln for maneuvering the South into the war, to lionize Lee, the slaveholder, and to lionize Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the country's largest slave traders, as heroes, to depict black people as inferior and passive, and to portray emancipation as a gift by a reluctant president out of questionable motivations. The anti-Lincoln writers gained steam, particularly in the 1920s. Historian Hamilton J. Eckenrode of the University of Virginia wrote Albert J. Beveridge, who was a historian and a U.S. Senator, that Lincoln was an unscrupulous politician of overmastering ambition with utter want of principle and indescribable hypocrisy. I wonder what he really thinks. Right? As for emancipation, he added, the chief result of the liberation of the Negro race has been the political paralysis of half the country and the general weakening of the nation. Richard Hofstadter, another very prominent historian, launched one of the more stinging indictments that has become a much repeated description of the proclamation. I see heads nodding. Yeah. In 1948, he published The American Political Tradition and the Men Who Made It. In the essay, Abraham Lincoln and the Self-Made Myth, he saw in all of Lincoln's actions, quote, a professional politician looking for votes, unquote. Lincoln was a reluctant emancipationist, a follower and not a leader of public opinion. His measures did nothing that Congress hadn't already done through the Second Confiscation Act, which is really not true, by the way. It was a callous effort, having, and this is the phrase that almost all historians just flee to because it's just so wonderful, it was a callous effort having, quote, all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. A man, Lincoln, who had exhibited he wrote a few good phrases, wouldn't you agree? You know, one or two, 7 years ago, you know, bind up the nation's wounds with might and the right as God gives the right, with malice towards none, with charity for all. There's nothing like that in the Emancipation Proclamation. Nothing even close. So a man who exhibited considerable power of language had created a landmark document with the lackluster prose of a cargo list. Well, other than black scholars such as John Hope Franklin and W.E.B. Du Bois, who created works to the contrary, the story of the Civil War and freedom, stressed by historians and educators over at least 50 years, had little to do with black people. The narrative emphasized white accomplishments. And even though this has been corrected in the academy over the last several decades, the lost cause retains power with the public, although its influence, I can see, is starting to diminish. This is why I think that Coates was spot on when he said that the war had been a story for white people, acted out by white people on white people's terms. So under the circumstances, maybe it's harder to explain the endurance of Emancipation Day celebrations rather than their decline. But it's the civil rights movement, and this is where it gets interesting, and the centennial celebration of the Civil War that serves for most historians as the turning points for the switch to an interpretation in African American minds as a reluctant emancipator. But only a few people, if any, would have seen this coming in the early 1960s. Black people, of course, had tried to capitalize on Lincoln in their freedom struggle of the 20th century. This is 1939, and this is Marian Anderson, famous singer, who sings in front of 75,000 person crowd of mostly African Americans in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King selected the historic site as the endpoint for a prayer pilgrimage to Washington on May 17th, 1957. It's your third quiz. You get your last chance here. May 17th. May 17th. May 17th. No, it's a good guess though. April 16th, it's District of Columbia. Brown versus Board of Education. It's important because it's going to come up again with King. While in 1961, they were still trying to use Lincoln and some of his power as a means of conveying the need to eradicate oppression in the country. While at a lunch at the White House, King saw an engraving on the White House wall of the Emancipation Proclamation. You could see it just, aha, Emancipation Proclamation. And it triggered his suggestion to John Kennedy that the president should issue a second Emancipation Proclamation, this one outlawing segregation. Kennedy, as you might expect, did not bite. But King then prepared, and it's a fascinating document, it's really interesting read, something called an appeal. It actually has a very long title, but an appeal is how you can think of it, that he submitted to the president on May 17th, 1962. You know it, yes. And in this appeal, he urged rededication to the principles of the Emancipation Proclamation and for an executive order prohibiting segregation in the United States of America. King opened this, it's a 64-page appeal. I mean, he's doing a lot of writing here, with a history lesson that leaned heavily on the Civil War and Reconstruction. He observed, it is precisely because race relations in America today are so deeply rooted historically in the socio-political conditions of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Black Codes, and their aftermath, that we believe the time has come for presidential leadership to be vigorously exerted to remove once and for all time the festering cancer of segregation and discrimination from American society. The president did not comply. His dependence on Southern Democrats before coming congressional elections provided too much of an obstacle. And he continued to misstep when it came to African Americans. In September 1862, during the centennial recognition of emancipation, he canceled his public appearance that he was supposed to make at that event so that he could attend America's Cup yacht races. He did furnish a video address for the Emancipation celebration, but he was, up there watching the yacht races. But this and other incidents involving the Civil War Centennial Commission, there were some controversies over segregation and some other things that came up, soured African American opinions on the historic event. Whether a correct assessment or not, the opinions of the white South at this particular moment seem to drive the nation's recognition of the past. The Pittsburgh Courier at this particular moment, in fact, chimed in, "What in the world are we celebrating? And who won the war anyway?" Well, then we come to one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history, and it's King again. On August 28, 1963, he addressed a teeming throng that occupied the mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Most people, you know this speech, most of you remember the poetic ending, right? In which the civil rights leader falls into his rhythmic chant of, "I have a dream today." But until recently, and David Blight is the person who helped steer us toward this, we haven't paid as close attention to how King opened his oration. In the second sentence, he proclaimed, quote, 50 years ago. Why? Invoking Lincoln, right? He says 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. I wish he had written the Emancipation Proclamation. This is much better. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. So Lincoln, the Civil War, emancipation still remained pretty important. Whether or not this reflected his true attitudes about the 16th president, the address shows that at least in 1963, black leaders like King still recognized the utility of using Lincoln as a means of reaching across the color bar to communicate with white people about the need for justice in the present. What is harder to explain is how quickly that changed. Perhaps it's a natural reaction over years of hearing how Lincoln gave black people freedom in the face of discrimination, of experiencing lynching, of encountering bad history, of receiving poor teaching, and what may be just as bad, of not being heard. Perhaps it was a new assertiveness by an emerging black militancy that did not want or need white historical figures to compel their activism. My colleague at Penn State, Crystal Sanders, who studies the civil rights era, says that black history and black studies programs exploded in the 1960s as a way of instilling pride in African Americans and, in her words, furthering the process of black liberation. So she says history started playing a role in this in a different way, in a very different way. In fostering black pride, scholars and lay people alike tended to move away from the great white hope messages, she says. For example, in the Head Start program that she studies, employees voted to observe the anniversaries of Nat Turner's rebellion and Medgar Evers' assassination in place of President's Day and the 4th of July. Sanders thinks that these kinds of conversations are indicative of a powerful shift happening in black communities that we can trace to black disappointment with the limits of racial change, outright distrust of even well-meaning whites, and growing black interest in history that has black people at the center and not at the margins. Whatever reasons, by 1968, we can see a sea change in black commentary about Abraham Lincoln and emancipation. As an indication of the rise of the reluctant emancipator school, scholars point to the essay that appeared that year by this fella, Leron Bennett Jr., who at that time was editor of Ebony magazine, which posed the question, it was a big headline, was Abe Lincoln a white supremacist? Well, Bennett asserted, Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator. As we shall see, there is abundant evidence to indicate that the Emancipation Proclamation was not what people think it is, and that Lincoln issued it with extreme misgivings and reservations. Bennett depicted Lincoln as a man of the fence, a man of the middle. Before the war, he made statements that showed his belief in black inferiority, which he actually had. During the war, he grew, Bennett says, but he didn't grow much. He was a white supremacist, albeit with good intentions. Well, today, academic historians have altered their position on Lincoln as the great emancipator, although we don't go as far as Bennett as a field. He does have a later book that actually came out in around 2003, 4, something like that. Yeah, that kind of pulls all this together. But today, most historians recognize emancipation, in the words of historian Eric Foner, as a process, not a single event. It arose from many causes and was the work of many individuals. It began before the Civil War, when slaves fled from plantations and proved that they did not welcome the hard hand of the master. It did not end until December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Well, this view restores the actions of the enslaved and free black people to the equation of freedom, even as it makes Lincoln a little less great of an emancipator. However, unlike Bennett, Foner recognizes that the proclamation, quote, was a turning point in this story, unquote. Okay, so where does this leave us? It saddens me that the connections with the proclamation have diminished from what they once were. I wish that we could revive Emancipation Days by African Americans as a more significant commemoration that acknowledges their own contribution to freedom. Even though, frankly, I do realize that this is starting to happen, at least sporadically, in places such as Washington and in select places even of the former Confederate States. Richmond has had to try to revive this tradition a little bit. But the celebrations have not quite regained their significance or the proliferation they once held. And maybe the answer is staring us in the face and we just haven't looked at it. And it's, anybody from Philadelphia? You guys came up with the answer a long time ago. This is Harry S. Truman in 1948, signing into law Freedom Day as February 1. Your last quiz. Nobody gets this. We know more about Groundhog Day than we do about Freedom Day. I gave you a clue. It's February 1 is the date that Lincoln signed the congressional document to send the 13th Amendment to the states for ratification. Richard Wright was a former slave, born a slave in Georgia, came here to Philadelphia and became a prominent black banker. He lobbied for and won a 3-cent postage stamp to recognize the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. In 1947, he successfully lobbied and won to get a presidential order to have February 1 as a National Freedom Day, which is still on the books. And to the best of my knowledge, isn't really, well, there, right? Not there. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could see the document actually signed, so he never watched this event. I also believe as we go forward that we shouldn't trumpet the notion of Lincoln as the great emancipator. That gives too much credit to one man, even though, frankly, he does deserve recognition for growth concerning racial matters and for taking important steps at important moments. Whether compelled by God, morality, or pragmatic politics, he added significant weight to the process. Still, we need to recognize that freedom came about because of the contribution of a larger numbers of people, politicians, military officers, soldiers, free blacks, enslaved Americans, and more. My closing wish is that we, and by that I mean all Americans, regardless of racial background, could adopt the vision of Frederick Douglass concerning Lincoln and emancipation. Within the past decade, historians have latched on to the speech that he gave for unveiling of the Emancipation Monument in Lincoln Park. This is 1 mile east of Capitol Hill, on Capitol Hill, 1 mile east of the Capitol. It's become famous now in the literature of Reconstruction especially. And it's one of the only extant outdoor statues representing emancipation that I know of in this country. At any rate, it's 1876, and Douglas is asked to give an address, and he absolutely hated this statue. Screams paternalism, doesn't it? And Douglas didn't like it. The face of that man, by the way, it was modeled after an actual slave, Archer Anderson, who was from Missouri, unaffected by the Emancipation Proclamation. There are great ironies in this statue. We could go on for a long time. Well, Douglas decided to speak anyway because it's an important event. And he must have raised eyebrows among the audience, largely white, who had gathered there, and included included President Grant, included the Supreme Court, all these dignitaries. And as he gets through his preamble, he finally comes to the point where he basically says that Lincoln was the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by force of circumstance and necessity. I have searched to try to find out what people thought, because I could just imagine people, we got this guy, where's he going with this? What's he going to do with it? Douglas is a smart man. He's a very smart man. He didn't leave it there. He showed the value of embracing ambiguity. What we should be teaching, I think, in a liberal arts environment. We have to learn not to put people into niches, but to accept their flaws and strengths and to create a synthesis from contradictory elements. Douglas resolved at least his contradictory impressions of Lincoln better than most then or now when he said, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Thank you. We fairly time for questions. Anybody have anything on their mind?
The whole time I was thinking, when we were discussing how Abraham Lincoln is not necessarily the savior that we always thought he was, as portrayed by history. But I wonder if it's like, how surprising is that when it was during the time of lynch mobs, when it was probably just as scary to be an abolitionist? Are people really surprised that this is true of Lincoln, or are they just surprised by the way it's been taught or misrepresented in history teachings?
It's a great question. I think probably it's especially when you're teaching because I've done this with teachers in middle schools and other places when you're teaching history, it's hard to teach this kind of subject with nuance, ambiguity, and depth. And so what you do is you gravitate toward the easy images and stock images. And one of the things that's the hardest, and if you ever have an answer for me on this, I would love to know what it is to get people to think historically. And you're thinking historically. You're talking exactly right. We'll ratchet back to a time when the values, beliefs were not what they are today, and people were operating within a different system. Lincoln at first does look like a racist, but even Douglas recognized that, oh my God, he's changing, he's coming along. And by the way, he was nowhere near the racist expressions of, say, the Democratic Party, which practiced Negrophobia as a means of getting elected back then. So even in the context of his times, Lincoln is nowhere near a zealot on that. And he honestly was truly an anti-slavery person. I've done some new research on a book I'm doing, and honestly, in 1863, he is pushing hard and even allowing the military to interfere in elections in the border states so that he can get anti-slavery congressmen into the Congress to try to get a 13th Amendment passed. He's doing that in the summer of 1863. This is the side of Lincoln we can't forget also. I wore them out. Yes.
Back to some of the stuff we were dealing with in this other essay that I mentioned as well. I guess I'm thinking of sort of how the separation of the history of slavery and the history of the Civil War, and how we know that the sort of history of slavery was erased from the history of the Civil War, and how, I mean, sort of, what's the time? When does that occur, and does that correspond with sort of, once the Civil War becomes the history of the Civil War becomes a history of, in which slavery has been separated out from that. Somehow the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery.
But let me answer that first. The question is, when did the slavery get sort of plucked out of the Civil War as being part of it? The answer is right around the 1890s it starts. However, I would have to tell you it's generational. In other words, the old Civil War veterans, they knew. They didn't care. Jubal Early actually left a manuscript that was never published. It basically came right out. The first sentence is basically, war came about because of agitation over slavery. I mean, they were unapologetic about it. They had grown up in that time, in that system. It was the newcomers, it was the next generation of folks who then began to rework that and to start to tear that out of the Civil War. And we're still trying to get it back in certain places. Stephen Colbert had a really wonderful show last year when all of this was coming up. In April last year, of course, the sesquicentennial, everybody wanted to interview everybody. And Colbert even had one of his reports on slavery, and he just nailed it. He put slavery right back into the Civil War. But it's going to take a while for some of the public to catch up to that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's actually part of what I want to tag on to, which is, how do we devise or come up with the kind of, say in a college like ours, come up with the kind of curriculum or the kind of way by which we can situate Lincoln and that entire coterie of activists within a more complex, more nuanced, context of understanding beyond the kind of standard or received national narrative about that particular event.
I think one of the first things to do is to be aware that there are competing narratives. That's the first start. And there's a tendency even in mine, when we get into our courses, we tend to try to find a cohesive narrative to try to lead students through. I think we just have to stop occasionally and remember we have to always remind that there is a competing narrative. I do that exercise with the Black heroes, just with my students, just to show how easy it is to stump them that there's a whole other history of this war that hasn't made it into the overarching narrative. And I use the Douglas document. I do, just to try to get people to think differently. I also teach something called the other side of heroes. And what I have are documents on Lincoln, having him talking about colonization, which makes people, when they first approach it, go, because he basically says, we can't live together in this country. I also show the documents concerning the whipping of slaves at Arlington that Robert E. Lee supervises, that appeared in, first of all, in the New York Herald in 1859, and then right after the war in an abolitionist newspaper in 1866, a charge that Lee and the family never denied, that seems to have some substance, just to try to say, okay, here's the other side of Lee. The 3 slaves, one of them female, whipped, and then he didn't do the beating, by the way, which was common for many planters, that you would hire it out or have a constable do it. And then, of course, after the whipping is administered, he ordered brine to be put on the backs of these people. And then I bring up Ulysses S. Grant and his Jewish order. When he started to expel people in 1862 from his theater of war because he was getting unhappy with all the trading and speculation that went on, he blamed it on Jewish people. He didn't stop with just the traders and speculators. he started shoving people out of their homes who were Jewish, who were in that area. But I don't leave it there. What I do is say, how do you put these people back together? How do you look at them in a bigger context? What new synthesis can you come up with about them? And they wrestle with it. They find that to be very, very interesting. And I found it a very useful approach. Because what it does do is begin to historicize these people too. How could Lincoln believe in colonization? How could Grant be potentially anti-Semite? How could Lee own and whip slaves? And as long as you try to look for those moments when the pieces don't fit in a narrative, I think then you start to create confusion and have people try to think about these things a little bit. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. Historically, you observe the changes that Americans have made through large changes in policy, such as either equal rights for blacks or the Emancipation Proclamation. How do you think the trend of Americans adapting a new policy and eventually coming to terms with it as a norm to how we as Americans deal with certain policies today, such as like gay rights, access to healthcare? Do you think we're going to have, I mean, I'm sure we will have like a history that's similar to how we have perceived and learned about the...
Absolutely. One of the things I challenge my students to think, before you dismiss people in the past too quickly, I could very easily see somebody 200 years from now looking back on us and saying, you had homeless people? You let them sleep on the streets and you did nothing about that? You had no psychological counseling for folks? You looked upon that as too expensive and not, you see what I mean? I could see, even though I am pro-choice, I'll announce that, but I could see 200 years from now people saying, this is how they solved their socioeconomic problems by allowing abortion. I could see, again, 200 years from now, people looking at us quite strangely, especially in how we don't handle some of these issues, and we tend to seek other solutions for them when they may look solvable and right in your face 200 years from now. By the way, I'm not trying to create commentary on it, but I could see where we could come under criticism for some of the things we just don't do in our backyard.
This is kind of going back to thinking about education. Interestingly enough, I was at a UP conference last June, and Gary Nash was talking about public history and public monuments being the venue to teach the public about history and about different narratives about history than we're exposed to in elementary school, middle school, high school. Because it is really difficult for these elementary school, middle school, high school teachers to teach anything other than this very straightforward narrative that's in the history books, and that is, frankly, a lot of the time misleading or, revealing. So my question is, how do you inform a public who doesn't have access to, doesn't have access to college, or doesn't have access to, or has access to public monuments like this, as opposed to the other?
So the question is, how do you inform the public outside of a classroom when many of them may not be in a classroom? Public history can be extraordinarily important. In fact, that's one of the huge emphases of a big conference that has almost every Civil War historian on earth, I think, going to Gettysburg in March to talk about the war at 150. But it's really to talk about how do we educate, especially in public sites. And the issue, especially of emancipation and slavery, are very hard because there is still a public that is resistant. You can be standing there with all the best of intentions, but there's no way that the people who line up for your battle walk or for your statue interpretation or for your cemetery, Lincoln Cemetery interpretation, they don't have to stay. They haven't paid anything. There's no grade. it's a problem. And in fact, that's really, I don't have a solution. I know that you have to try. But it also makes some of the interpreters who are on the front lines somewhat uncomfortable, because there are moments, I can tell you, like at Gettysburg, if somebody starts talking about slavery and the Civil War, where some people, and they're not all Southerners, will fight back and rebel and just not want to hear it and walk away. So anyway, but you can't give up.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to try. I mean, you have to put it out there.
I was just thinking, 'cause I don't do Civil War generally, but I was thinking that the Civil War is such a popular history subject for people. You know, you go into the bookstore and there's just books on books about the Civil War, and some of them are better than others. And I don't know, that just seems like that is a tricky place where the Civil War is it's so much a part of American culture, and people have very specific ideas about it.
I don't know whether you're saying the Civil War is an opportunity or a problem.
I think it's both. I think
Okay.
it's both. I just think it's a tricky.
I think here's one thing that you should know about the Civil War that is a problem, and that is clouding how things get done, is that to a large extent, the meta-narrative, the popular meta-narrative of the Civil War, including the military aspects and so on, have been gravitating more and more to the hands of the amateur. They are not in the hands of professional historians. Some of that is not bad. There are some very good non-academic historians who are rigorous, who apply critical examination of sources, and who produce good works. But the problem is that the way the public thinks about the war and wants to, that story is being generated and reproduced and published more often in the non-academic areas than they are in professional historians. Partly because, we're kind of boring. We like nuance. We like to qualify everything and keep the story muddy. And the public sometimes likes a story that's neater. But that is a problem in the Civil War. And I don't know how to solve that, except to do this. Hi. Stand in front of you and talk. Okay. Yeah, was that a hand?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have time for maybe one more. Anybody else have a question or comment I'd like to add?
So I have a question that comes from that sort of stirring final scene in Lincoln, which does pull kind of poetic anti-slavery language, but from the second inaugural.
Mm-hmm.
And so that question leads me to whether the second inaugural ever played a role in these commemorations of emancipation in
that's a fabulous question, and my answer is I've never seen it. The question is, did the second inaugural ever play a role in these kinds of celebrations? And the answer is, I've been through tons of African-American newspapers and sources. I never saw as much as one reference to that. I could have missed it because I may not have been looking for it, and that could be my fault. But it certainly is not prominent. The Emancipation Proclamation itself was prominent. It was read, it was recited, featured. I've had others tell me that if you actually sit and listen to an oration of it, that it's not that bad. I haven't been tempted yet to try it. But Lincoln's second inaugural would be lovely. Yeah, certainly preferable. Has a lot more going for it in terms of poetry, not in terms of.
There's even a rhyming couple.
Ooh. I sense an English major. Wonderful. Was that it? Thank you. I really had a great time, and it's wonderful to visit your campus. And thanks for having me.